the aesthetics and the photos and how it looks on Instagram and who is promoting it. And hey everyone, Kristen from Made It Better Wanna Knits here today to hopefully not ramble too much, but just talk a little bit about why I mostly quit knitting pattern design. So if you've been here a while, you'll know that up until, I guess, 2020, which was a great year for all of us, I was not a full-time knitting pattern designer because I was at home with 2 kids, but a part-time knitting pattern designer because only one of my kids was in full-day school. And so what that meant was I was releasing somewhere between 15 and 20 new knitting patterns every year. And now I'm not doing that. My kids were back in school full time. I had to decide whether I was going to try to continue to have a knitting pattern design business as my primary job or to pursue something else. And I decided to pursue something else. I am a freelance translator, and I'm not going to get into that too much. What I want to focus on is not why I picked translation, but why I didn't pick knitting pattern design. And it's basically because knitting pattern design is terribly underpaid, is evolving to a point where designers are expected to produce so much that it's not sustainable, is largely underappreciated, and has really no stability whatsoever. When I was a part-time, maybe half-time knitting pattern designer, never earned more than, I did a blog post about this, I probably should have looked it up. I want to say in my best year, I earned something like $14,000 gross. So that's to say that was the actual income from selling patterns and a couple of e-courses. So it didn't take into account taxes, paying tech editors, advertising, supply, yarn and other things. It didn't take into account all of the overhead expenses, the editing software that I use for charts and all of those things that add up. So that was just the actual amount of money that I brought in, not including expenses. And so even if I could assume that I would double that working full time, it was not going to be enough. And it was also simply not sustainable, because the only way to consistently sell patterns is to constantly be releasing new patterns. And I think now is a good example. As I said, I'm still designing some patterns occasionally just for fun when I can, like this sweater that I love and I wanted to make it a thing. So I think maybe I released, I don't know, 2 or 3 patterns this year. And that, I did sell some of my new patterns, but I sold almost none of my existing patterns. And I have a back catalog of about 100 patterns. And I hardly sold any of them. I've got something like 8,000 followers on Instagram. I've got about 1,500 followers here on YouTube. So there are people out there that know who I am and know what I do. I'm out there interacting with knitters and potential customers all the time. And still, because I am not constantly releasing new patterns and putting something out there that's going to garner some immediate attention, all of the pattern sales drop off. It's this nice idea that you can, just have a back catalog and have this passive source of income. But in reality, it's very small. It's a very small amount of income coming from anything that you released more than a couple of months ago. And so that part really is very difficult to sustain. So that's one thing, the constant pressure for new patterns in order to stay relevant. Two, people aren't willing to pay a fair value price for knitting patterns. If you are somebody who is a very popular designer and you sell hundreds of each pattern that you release, then maybe $6 a pattern is going to earn you a decent income. But the number of designers who can do that, it's probably about a dozen, maybe 20. For everyone else, we're not selling hundreds of every pattern we release. And I actually had an interaction, I won't call it an argument, an interaction with someone on Instagram a couple of weeks ago who said that if you're, any good as a designer, you're going to easily sell 300 or 400 of every pattern, and so $5 a pattern is fair. First of all, this person was just making up numbers. 3 or 4, like I said, hardly anybody is consistently selling 300 to 400 of every pattern that they produce. That's a very small number of designers. And second, the idea that if you're a good designer, you will magically get sales doesn't work like that either. There are a lot of very talented and very meticulous pattern designers out there writing excellent patterns that aren't selling anywhere near that, because it's not about that. It's, the aesthetics and the photos and how it looks on Instagram and who is promoting it, and and then it becomes this back and forth of this designer is popular, so all of the yarn stores are going to immediately promote her patterns and make kits for her patterns, and then so in turn she's going to get more popular, and then going to bring more income into the yarn shop that is going to continue to promote her patterns. It all works together. And if you look at Instagram, primarily where this is happening, it's just a handful of designers that you're really seeing this kind of, every time they release a pattern, it becomes popular. And I don't know what the magic is there. Every designer has to start from somewhere, but I don't know what it is that some designers right out of the gate just get picked up by the algorithm, or one very well-known, voice in the knitting community picks up their work and starts promoting it, and it just kind of snowballs from there. But that's a very small percentage of designers, and there are literally thousands of knitting pattern designers around the world. But the suggestion that if you're good, you'll just magically sell patterns is ridiculous. There are a lot of truly excellent designers out there who are very good at their job that just aren't catching someone's eye for whatever reason. All that leads back to my original point, which is that even though a handful of designers can probably make a sustainable income selling $6 patterns, that is because their sales volume is so great. And for the majority of designers, their sales volume, even though they're very good and very talented and are producing new patterns all the time, their sales volume isn't that high. And so charging $5 or $6 a pattern isn't going to get them a livable wage. Related to that, even if a certain, small percentage of designers can make a decent wage off a $6 pattern, $6 per pattern, no matter how many you're selling, is just not reflective of the amount of work that goes into it, especially for garments. So, if you're selling patterns that are, I don't know, a sock or a hat or something like a very basic shape that you're just maybe plugging some stitch patterns into, that's a very different issue than trying to create garment patterns in multiple sizes. And that leads into the next point, which is that knitters are constantly wanting more from their patterns, but aren't willing to pay more. So when I started knitting in 2007, most patterns were about $5, 15 years ago. But most patterns were very basic. So a sweater pattern probably included 5 sizes. It didn't include any video tutorials. It didn't include samples knit in a bajillion sizes with photos of all of them on Ravelry so you could see how it looks on every different body shape. It didn't include these very fancy, kind of photo shoots walking through the woods and everything looks aesthetic and beautiful. You're not so much selling your knitting pattern as this like lifestyle that people are aspiring to. It didn't include any of those things. It was just a basic knitting pattern that may have even said things like reverse shaping for the other side. So yeah, it only cost $5. But now there are a lot more demands on pattern designers. Your garment patterns have to be size inclusive, and we really need you to have video tutorials for these techniques, and it would be great to see samples on in different sizes and different yarns and different yarn budgets, and we need the charts to also have the written instructions so that the pattern is accessible, and all of those are really great things to aspire to. Those are great things to have in a pattern. And in an ideal world, every pattern would have them. But not for $6 a pattern being developed by the indie pattern designer working out of her home and photographing her own samples. So again, you get back to the point where a handful of designers are making enough money to make all of those things happen. But the vast majority are not. And the vast majority of knitters are not willing to pay a fair price for a pattern, again, especially for a garment, maybe that's $10 or $12, to support all of those things happening. So you've got this hamster wheel of constantly producing new patterns. You have terrible wages. You have constant pressure to improve and include more and more in your patterns, and then you have an unwillingness to pay a higher price for those patterns. So no matter how much I enjoy creating and designing patterns, which I do, all of those things are pretty big negatives. And then add to that all the stuff I just don't like about designing patterns. Working toward deadlines and grading and writing out written instructions for charts and answering, pattern support questions that are really people basically asking to be taught how to knit, which is a different job, and just feeling like I was like shouting into a void every time I had a new release, trying to get attention when there's so much else, out there in the market. Those are just things I didn't like about a job that overall I enjoyed most aspects of. So when the time came to choose, obviously, you know, for my family, I needed to make a choice of a job that had better potential earnings, but I also had to choose something that was not gonna drive me crazy. And that is, you know, if I'm translating things, that's what I'm doing, and I'm not comparing myself to other people. When I'm designing knitting patterns and I release something that I love and, you know, nobody buys it, and then this other popular designer releases something that's maybe kind of similar, and everybody buys it, and then, you know, listening to people tell me that patterns aren't worth what I think that they're worth, and you know, it's very disheartening. You know, ultimately at the end, it was, do I want to continue doing this job that I love but that doesn't really love me back? Or do I want to move into something that, you know, maybe it's not quite so much fun. Maybe I don't enjoy it quite as much, but it's also, you know, more consistent, more stable, a little less harsh at the end of the day. And it is wonderful that there are, you know, that handful of designers that are having such great success. And I'm very happy for them. But if I can leave you with any thought, it's just to bear in mind that that is a very, very, very tiny percentage of knitting pattern designers making a living from designing patterns. Most of them are not. And if you feel compelled to bemoan the prices of knitting patterns, that's something to bear in mind as well. So at the end of the day, that was my decision. That's why I mostly quit knitting pattern design. I do still, like I said, release patterns occasionally. So if you want to know about them, be sure that you are subscribed to the channel here, or you can sign up for my newsletter. Link in the description box down below. I would love to see you in the Media Peruana Knits community. You can also find me on Instagram as @MediaPeruana and hear all about not just my designs, but my other knitting that I at least now get to knit other designers' patterns and have been enjoying that since I retired. Thank you for joining me here on the Media Peruana Knits channel, and I hope I will see you again in a video very soon.